can you explain what exactly metabolic flexibility is?
Yeah, so in the fitness world, everyone wants to argue about, this fitness in general is very extremes. So it's got to be, fasting for 7 days or going keto or eat all the carbohydrates you can find. It's never really a moderate approach. So there's always argument about what is the best fuel, right? So some people say, okay, fat's the best fuel. And then other people say, no, but you can't do a lot of high intensity exercise. And metabolic flexibility says, well, it depends on what you're actually trying to do. So our body is very good at using both fats and carbohydrates overall. Just depends on what you're trying to do. All right. So metabolic flexibility is how well can you use fats, maybe on like the left end of the spectrum, the low intensity side. How well can you use carbohydrates on maybe the right end of the spectrum or the higher intensity side. And then how well can you actually switch back and forth between those two?
Hey friends, welcome to the Health Simple Show. I'm your host, Kyle Reedhead, and I interview health and wellness experts from around the world to help you live healthy, happy, and stress-free. Now don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and if you have any questions about anything we talk about through this episode, just comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Enjoy the show.
You don't necessarily have to pick only one fuel. I would argue that that's becoming more metabolically inflexible. It's just getting you closer to a disease state. It's how well can you use both the highest degree, depending upon context, and then how well can you switch back and forth as needed.
Closer to a disease state if you're using one side of the spectrum. Can you dive into that a little bit further?
So what we look at, so if we have the right end of the spectrum is carbohydrates and the left end is fat. So we know that some people, so initially when this was proposed to me back almost like 12 years ago, I just, like I said, wandered over to the physiology department. My advisor comes in the first day and he's like, all right, we got 2 new projects and they both involve a lot of math. And looking around the table, and most exercise phys students, unless you're a subdivision or hardcore biomechanics or motor learning or some stuff, you don't really take a lot of math. It's just not part of the requiem. And he looks at me and he's like, hey, you math boy, whatever your name is, these are your projects now. So since I transferred from engineering, I was the math boy. So that's how I got those projects. So with that, you're a little bit more apt to look at things as a dynamic system, not a static system. And the first question I had was, well, isn't that just how everyone operates, right? So if it's not changing from one person to the next, then what good is it, right? It's not all that useful. And then when you look in the research, you find that on the fat end of the spectrum, 3 studies have been done. There's probably a couple more. I did one, Helges did one, Godecki did one. And basically you just kind of grab people off the street, recreational exercisers, not elite athletes, but people that are, just kind of move around, not obese subjects, generally healthy. And you hook them up to a metabolic cart, which is this little tube they stuff in your mouth, and it tells you how much fat and how much carbohydrates you're using. And if you look at rest or very low intensity exercise, you find that how well people can use fat will vary between 93% down to 20%. Meaning some people are really, really good at using fat at those low intensities, and some people are really, really bad at it. There's a fair amount of plasticity on that end of the spectrum. Not nearly quite as much on the carbohydrate end of the spectrum, but we still see some there, right? So you see people like type 2 diabetics in general have a very hard time using high amounts of carbohydrates. So what does their body do? It puts out, in general, more insulin, right? So if I put out more insulin, I'm going to try to get those carbohydrates out of the bloodstream, put them into muscle, put them into fat. I don't really care per se if I'm the body, if I'm survival based. I just don't want blood glucose to get super high in the bloodstream because that's going to be bad news bears. So it's going to try to do that. Insulin goes up. But when insulin goes up, it actually prevents you from moving to use fat as well. So if I want to acutely shift you into using more fat, we'll do things to try to lower your insulin, fasting, less carbohydrates, things like that. And what you see in a type 2 diabetic is initially they get crushed from the right end of the spectrum, right? They have this carbohydrate metabolism issue. But the body, in trying to keep up with that and trying to do everything that it needs to do, they also start getting squished from the fat end of the spectrum. So they actually become metabolically inflexible. They have a very hard time shifting all the way to the right. They have a very hard time shifting all the way to the left. And if we measure how fast they can even transition between those two fuels, that's also impaired. Meaning if we gave them a whole just crap ton of carbohydrates and just let them fast for many hours, how long would it take them to use those, so to speak, to oxidize them and to get back to using fat in a fasting condition? That takes way longer than a healthy individual. And consequently, how high they can go to use those carbohydrates with a huge influx, they can't quite get as high as someone who's healthy. So they're getting scrunched from both ends. So in essence, you can think of it as they're getting sort of locked into kind of one fuel mixture and not able to go to either end.
Now, what's the benefit in being able to go to both ends?
Yeah, so there's a couple benefits. In general, although it is a massive generalization, you could argue that being able to use fat is probably going to be better for body composition. That gets into a whole subtangents of fasted cardio and a bunch of other stuff. But if your body has a harder time using fat as a fuel, you're not oxidizing fat that well. I would argue it's going to be harder to stay in a caloric deficit, most likely. Data on that is very, very split right now. We don't have a ton of good data on that. Also, from a health standpoint, if you're running around just burning through tons of carbohydrates at rest, one, you don't need to do that. And then two, I would argue that that's like me going out with my little Jetta and redlining it all the time. I'm probably applying a lot more stress to the vehicle that I don't need to perform that task. On the carbohydrate end of the spectrum, we want to keep carbohydrates high in order to have a high amount of performance. So on that side, I think that's what you're going to look at mostly for that. If we see someone who goes on like a ketogenic type diet, we know that very high fat, very low carbohydrates, moderate-ish to maybe low protein, depending on whose standards you use, over time, that actually will impair the body's use of carbohydrates. Now, that will actually change, but if we take someone who's been keto and we just give them a boat ton of carbohydrates and we measure how well they can use those carbohydrates right away, it's not super good. So like speed and power, you'll see a single-digit percentage kind of drop off on that high end. They can still use them, but just not as efficiently as they could otherwise. So we see that it's kind of plastic on both sides of the spectrum. And to me, for vast majority of people, you don't need to go to that extreme unless you've got some frank pathology, or maybe you've got cancer, you've got, some type of disease state. Okay, yeah, I could make an argument maybe for going more extreme because of that. But a normal, quote unquote, healthy person, to me, if you're more metabolically flexible, that is, I would say, more of a marker of a health status.
So is the goal to be burning fat when you're at rest? We're more efficient in that way. Is that what you would say? And then if you're going to be training, you want to be burning carbohydrates. Is that kind of the goal of it all?
Yeah. So I would say at rest, burning fat's going to be a better fuel to use. We can get more ATP per mole or per amount of fat. The downside of burning fat is that it takes longer. So we can't get a lot of that energy super fast. But if you're at rest, I don't need to worry about rate. However, if I go to do some speed and power, I go to lift weights, I go to do some high intensity intervals, especially as those continue, now rate becomes a really, really big deal. So even though bioenergetically I can produce more ATP, more cellular currency from fat, the catch with that is I can't do it at a very high rate. So as exercise intensity scales up, if I only have fat as a fuel source, I become very, very impaired on that end of the spectrum.
Okay, it makes sense. And so, for athletic performance, that makes complete sense. You want to be carbohydrate driven when you're training. If you're looking to lose weight, what are your thoughts then on either doing it fasted or, in a ketogenic diet, let's say, where you're burning fat rather than carbs? Do you find it's more beneficial that way, or would you still recommend your clients that are looking for weight loss to be using carbs?
My bias is I still like them to use carbohydrates. Obviously my friend Ben House says, and I like this, that, caloric deficit and calories are the kind of the trump card. So we're talking kind of, I don't want to say independent of calories, but we're going to assume that people are already in a caloric reduced state. So the benefit of a ketogenic type diet is for people who don't like tracking, they don't want to keep track of anything, most people will spontaneously eat fewer calories. So they're automatically going to be more in a caloric deficit. If you start having more carbohydrates, people tend to overeat on them. So they tend to be not in a caloric deficit unless they're doing some type of formal program. They're working with someone, they're actually tracking to see where they're at. So my bias is that what I don't like about ketogenic diets is if you don't really care at all about your performance per se, they can be okay. I mean, I've had clients that use them. I think they can be fine. But I always still will monitor their performance, because if you're going to the gym a lot or 3 to 4 times a week, and your performance is starting to trend down, that can be pretty powerfully demotivating. So you want to keep an eye on that. So if you're doing a ketogenic type diet, it may be, okay, let's pull back your efforts so you're not kind of redlining it as hard all the time, kind of hang out in this more moderate type zone in terms of effort or RPE. That can be okay. But my preference is we'll just give you some carbohydrates so you can perform in the gym, and then we'll get you to transition to use more fat when you're not in the gym, so that you can see performance usually will go up or stay pretty good unless you get really, really aggressively in a low caloric deficit. And then you can use fat the rest of the time. And even if you're not an extremely high level athlete, I find that it's more motivating going to the gym to see progress. Because if body comp is your number one goal, man, even if we had a DEXA in my living room, we DEXA you every day, it's plus or minus, 1, 2, maybe 3% body composition difference, meaning that it's not like dead nuts on all the time. So if you gained 3 pounds of fat, just even by pictures, it's probably going to be hard to tell. Or if you lost 3 pounds of fat, even by pictures, it's probably going to be hard to tell depending on how big you are. But if you added 2 more reps to your bench press, or you went up 5 pounds, or you used 35-pound dumbbells instead of 30-pound dumbbells, it's much easier to see those changes. And those changes are what actually is going to drive performance, calories expended, adding more lean body mass. So that is one of the drivers that you want to look at. Because I see one of the biggest mistakes people make for body comp is, oh, bro, I just go to the gym, I lift hard, 3 to 4 days a week. And I look and I tell them, okay, just write down everything you do at the gym for the next 2 weeks. Okay, and then send it to me. And you look and you go, well, yeah, it was harder, but you didn't ask your body to really do anything more. There's no progressive overload in your training. So there's no reason for your body to add more strength or more muscle mass or anything like that. So if you're missing that stimulus, that's going to be number one. And number two, when you see those small increments, I find that it's pretty motivational for people. So you're getting them to be looking for the thing that's going to drive those long-term changes in a beneficial direction.
Yeah, makes complete sense. And I mean, if you're looking for weight loss, the goal is to increase your metabolism, which is by building lean muscle. And so if you can do that by throwing in some carbs to get a bit more performance, as you said, well, then it makes complete sense. That's really what you want to be doing. So yeah, it makes sense to me. Now, so when you're looking at a diet for a client, do you recommend switching it up from low carb to high carb? Is that how you get them metabolically flexible? Or are you just having like well-balanced meals where you have some fat, some carbs within the meal?
Depends on the person. I would say most people in general, their meal plan-ish is going to be pretty boring. It's like, okay, pretty high amount of protein, some carbs. It could be fruit, vegetables, things like that, a little bit of fat. My tendency as that gets to be more extreme is I tend to be a little bit lower on fat, 40, 60, 80, 100 grams of fat, maybe depending on the person. And then I will probably play more with carbohydrates, and protein will stay pretty similar. So I found that carbohydrate tolerance maybe, or how many carbs people can consume and maintain weight stable, varies massively from one person to the next person. And so that's the hardest part to figure out. So I have one guy who's training to be qualify for the CrossFit Games, and he's consuming 450, 500 grams at one point of carbohydrates per day. Obviously training very hard, all that kind of stuff too. Other people, 150, 200, that's probably relatively normal depending on the size of the person and how much they're training and things of that nature. Mm-hmm. I generally don't like going much below 100 or 120 grams carbs per day. And then in advanced athletes, I will change it depending on their training. So if Monday, let's say they lift later in the day or after work on Monday, they may get 250 grams of carbs that day. The next day is Tuesday. Let's say that's just a light, easy aerobic-based development. They'll be able to do that maybe in their garage in the morning before work. So they'll do that fasted, and their carbohydrates may only be 120 or 140 that day. So I'll kind of zigzag their carbohydrates a little bit. So I'm providing them more carbohydrates on the day that they're going to use them more and have a little bit more recovery. And then the days where they're not, I'll just usually cut them out and cut them a little bit lower. And it's an easy way to kind of sneak calories out of their diet also without severely impairing their performance either.
Is this termed carb cycling?
Kind of, yeah. Usually when they say carb cycling, that who knows what the hell that term actually means. But yeah, I will vary their carbohydrates. People, when I start though, I usually have them do what I call just flat macros if they're actually tracking macros, which you don't have to do per se, because I want them to get in that consistent habit. I want them to figure out what a decent looking meal looks like. I don't want them to necessarily change it too much. And then we'll see how far we can get on that. But then the next step is I will actually have more carbs and less carbs depending on the training.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things I've read quite a bit about and had a few other guests on the podcast here is basically getting fat adapted. So what they do is they put someone into a ketogenic diet for, I think it's usually about 3 weeks or so. And that sort of teaches the body to be able to burn fat efficiently. And then at that point, you can then add carbs back in. Is that a way of improving your metabolic flexibility? Is that something you would utilize as well? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not a big fan of that, to be honest, unless there was some super hard deadline and also having a way to measure it.
Okay.
I agree with it in theory. The hard part depends on the person's goals. So most people, to really get fat adapted, you're probably gonna need more than 3 weeks. Although the variability on that is, if you look in the literature, is pretty massive. I find that by having them go super restrictive, the transition into that can be pretty brutal. Like people hear the keto flu and all that stuff. And while it's debatable, is it a hydration issue? Is it an electrolyte issue? That's still probably up for debate. But I have seen people who just don't report that they feel very good, even though we've had their hydration good. Everything else has been on point. And I think it's just too hard of a transition for a lot of people. So what I do instead is I'll look and say, okay, if I don't have a metabolic cart or I don't have a way to measure it, what is a proxy that I could use for what is this person's ability to use fat? And I'll use how long can they go for a period of fasting and generally feel pretty good and perform pretty well. That's kind of a rough proxy for fat oxidation. Is it perfect? No. But if you put a gun to my head and say, okay, pick one test without any fancy equipment at all, it's probably what I would use. And ideally, I want to see them hit about 19 to 24 hours. Okay. And then the meal that they have after should just be an absolute normal looking meal. The first time I ever did fasting was probably almost 10, 12 years ago. I did that for 15 hours and ran across the street and sat at a Chinese buffet for 3 hours. So I probably pushed my fast a little bit too far.
Yeah.
So that's what I'll use as a proxy for that. And let's say they can only do 12 hours, even overnight. That's kind of pushing it. Then I'll be like, okay, so let's just take 1 day per week and let's push out your fast by just, 1 to 2 hours. So if you did 12 hours from Sunday night to Monday morning, let's go 14 hours the next day. So the next week. And then let's add 2 hours to that the following week. So within about 6 to 8 weeks, I find that most people can do a 19 to 24 hour fast pretty easily. And I know that if they're fasted at that point, so metabolically, what did I do? Overnight, liver glycogen is going to be low, but muscle glycogen, unless they're doing training, isn't really going to be tapped that much at all. So initially I have them do it on an off day or just an easy aerobic type day. And when they're doing that, that is probably the biggest, outside of exercise, the biggest metabolic hammer I can give them to upregulate the use of fat. Now you could argue, well, why don't you just do a ketogenic day, right? Why don't you just have like every Tuesday be keto day? Well, the hard part about that is you probably need multiple days in a row to get more of a ketogenic type adaptation, and probably multiple weeks in a row. As we mentioned earlier, the downside to that is you're losing some of that carbohydrate end of the spectrum. Now, if you're doing a ketogenic diet for some, pathology, or that's what you enjoy and you don't care about that, cool, that's awesome. Then it doesn't matter to you, and as long as you're compliant. But I don't want to lose that end of the spectrum unless I have to. And if I skip forward and go, okay, what do most people want to do? Right? So you pull most people off the street and you go, okay, what is it from the metabolism side? What is your holy grail that you want to get to? It's usually, I want to drink beer once in a while, I want to eat carbs, and I want to lose 30 pounds and not really have to worry about anything. Right? Most people won't say, I never want to eat a carbohydrate the rest of my life. So maybe we should train them a little bit on how to do that. Maybe we should put that into a semi-sane approach where they can do that. And then with fasting, what's also super cool is we can then give them a fair amount of carbohydrates the next day, and we don't lose that carbohydrate end of the spectrum. So the fancy term for that, if you can look up Trent Stillingworth has got some stuff on PDH enzyme adaptation, pyruvate dehydrogenase, and it's a little gatekeeper to glycolysis, kind of the carbohydrate end of the spectrum. We put people on a ketogenic diet. The longer they're on it, the more this enzyme changes. So they're losing a little bit of that carbohydrate end of the spectrum. However, if we fast them, even for 24 hours or maybe 48 hours, not that you need to go that extreme, that enzyme doesn't seem to change. So I could have you fast on, let's say, Tuesday, and let's say Wednesday you've got a heavy strength and power type training session. I could give you 300 grams of carbohydrates again Wednesday, and you're going to be perfectly fine. You're not going to see that down regulation on the carbohydrate end of the spectrum. Now, that may be because fasting is very short, maybe because muscle glycogen is not really being used most of the time. Who knows? But I find with fasting, I can get almost all the benefits that I really want from a ketogenic diet for most people without kind of the consequence of doing it. And in reality, when I first started having people do fasting stuff over 10 years ago, I actually thought it was going to be a debacle. I thought, this is the worst idea anyone has ever presented to me. This is a horrible idea. You're telling me not to eat for a full day? That is stupid. All my muscle is going to fall off. My metabolism is going to tank. And even if those are, let's say, don't change, no one in their right mind is going to do this. And I found that as long as I was progressive about it, it actually was very easy for people to do it. And it was easier for them, in my experience, to do it than to have a very low calorie day. So to tell them, okay, just eat one meal a day and just have it be pretty low calorie. I don't know if it's a physiology or a psychology thing that as soon as they had that meal, they felt like they wanted to eat again. So I found, okay, just do 12 hours, 14 hours, whatever. And that was easier for them. And again, maybe that's all psychological too, right? Here's your options. Don't eat until this time. Okay, that's pretty simple.
One of the things that I found with fasting, because it's something I've been doing for quite some time now, is if I'm having a heavy carb day or eating a lot of carbs often, I find it very difficult to be able to fast for longer periods of time. So for me, kind of switching it up and going more heavy fat and low carb is what allowed me to fast for longer periods and to be able to do it without really any issue. Do you see that playing a role at all?
Potentially. What type of fasting protocol do you follow, since there's like 800 different ones now?
There's a million. So I've been doing 16-8 for a while.
Okay.
I've recently brought that down a bit. So now I'm doing about 10 to 12 hour eating window. It just kind of depends.
Yeah.
I'm trying to put on muscle mass. So I've kind of slowed down on the fasting as much.
Yeah. Possibly. So I would look, it could be a whole bunch of factors. It could be training, could be stress, could be sleep, could be Some people just in general, I think we'll find are not as carbohydrate tolerant, although the studies on that are just an absolute mixed bag of who knows what the hell's going on. Because how do you assess that? What is your measure? No one can agree on that. Is it an insulin clamp study? Is it looking to see when you kind of overshoot your blood glucose and it goes super high? Is it insulin? Is it glucagon? So no one can entirely agree on that. Trying to predict that from genetics is kind of a crapshoot. You can look at the diet. Chris Gardner did the Diet Fit study on that. So what I find is that even people I've had experience with who are doing everything, I would say, correct. So I worked with a female physique competitor who was very nationally ranked. She was, pretty short, not real tall, had a lot of muscle, but extremely lean. And she was still eating 200 grams of carbs like a couple days before her show. I'd have a guy that was twice her size, and he was maxed out at like 220 grams of carbs. So it wasn't necessarily always muscle mass either. So maybe it's movement during the day. The short answer is I don't know. But with fasting, you can play around with those windows and the amount of time. Mm-hmm. And my bias for most people is to do 1 day of fasting and then the rest. I do like having more protein, trying to stimulate mTOR, trying to keep as much lean muscle mass as possible. I have had a few people use a 16-8. They usually came to me when they were already using it and they were happy with their results. And so we just kind of tweaked a few things and kind of left them on that. But my personal bias is that's probably not where I would start. But I think that's also a lifestyle question too. Because the people I know who enjoy it, they usually have a very busy life. And if you can eliminate them from eating for those periods of time, that's kind of a win in their book. So it's like, I'll give up a theoretical, maybe a couple pounds of lean mass a year just because every day this makes my life so much easier. And that's cool. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I think the other thing to point out too is that we say carbs, but it depends on the type of carbs that you're eating as well. That's going to make a massive difference. If it's refined grains or some sugar or sugary drinks, then that's a huge difference compared to a sweet potato or some quinoa or some rice. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Now, the one thing you mentioned that was interesting was you hear that, some people deal with carbs better. Some people deal with fats better. And that's why you hear people that, I like the ketogenic. I didn't like the ketogenic diet because it just didn't do well with me. You're saying that might not be a thing, or we don't even know yet?
We don't know because most of the people I've talked to now who say they're doing a ketogenic diet, I would argue are not even doing a ketogenic diet. So unless you get a blood stick to see where your levels of ketones actually are, we don't really even know if you're doing a ketogenic diet. And even then, there's a sliding scale, right? So how high, usually you're measuring BHB, beta hydroxybutyrate. How high on that spectrum are you? Again, if you're trying to treat a pathology, you may need to go pretty high. If you're in nutritional ketosis, some people feel pretty good at a lower level. And even beyond that, not to make it utterly just complicated, is what are we looking at when we do that? We're looking at circulating levels of beta hydroxybutyrate in your blood. That tells us nothing about the production rate and nothing about the use rate. It would be like if I go into my bathtub and look and go, hey, the water level's halfway high. But now I open the drain and I turn the faucet on. Looking at the water level, you have no idea how much water is coming in or how much water is going out. If I change both those flow rates, I can move the level up and down at different variables. So I think we'll find some people, even at a low BHB level, feel pretty good and are probably pretty efficient at using ketones and may feel better there. I get nervous about people trying to push their ketones super high because like the bathtub analogy, if I plug the drain and I increase the amount coming in, well, sure, I can increase the amount that's showing up in the blood. Does that mean you're going to feel better? I don't know. Maybe that's all psychosomatic too. But in the reality is it's probably some people do better at different amounts. Last thing on that too is I've often wondered is if you do a ketogenic diet or we give you like a ketone supplement, a salt or an ester, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. I feel like super good. My brain feels awesome. Woohoo! I'm like, well, that's good that you found something that worked.
Yeah.
In my head, I'm thinking, do you have a massive issue to glucose that maybe you don't know about? If we give your brain another fuel, does that mean, because your nervous system is always comparing your two states. And with a ketone type supplement, we can do this in a very short order. Does that mean that maybe your brain has some glucose issues that we should be worried about, especially in regards to health? I don't know. I don't have any answers there.
What do you mean by glucose issues? What would that be? Is that like a metabolic syndrome?
Kind of. So you can look, there's, stuff where they said Alzheimer's is kind of like, type 3, diabetes. And there is some truth to that, right? So there is some truth that the brain primarily will use glucose above everything else. It will use ketones. However, physiologically, ketones were primarily only during starvation, right? So ketones to me and ketogenesis is the backup system to your normal metabolism. So the fact that we could take Bob, who's 50 pounds overweight, is 45 years old, never seen a gym in his life, loves Lars, 7-Eleven Slurpees with no ice. And if we throw him in a metabolic chamber and we lock him in there and we have him fast for 5 days, he would probably reach a ketogenic state. Now, would he hate you? Absolutely. Would he be happy? Not happy at all. Is it ethical? Probably not. But the fact that that system in his body has never been ran for 45 years of his existence, that the body would conserve that so that just on the off chance that that happens, he has another system to fall back on. That to me is like kind of mind-blowing. But I do wonder that most of the time that's a backup system. So now we can do things with technology to kind of, I wouldn't say override that, but kind of move that spectrum around. So I wonder if people who feel really good on a ketone, maybe they've got some underlying glucose metabolism issue in their brain where it's just not using glucose as well. So we give it a different fuel that it can really use, which again, we can do with the supplement in short order. Now it's like, oh, this is great. Does that mean the ketones are superior? Because it's comparative, right? I would argue that maybe the glucose use wasn't all that good.
Makes sense.
And
So
not a lot of data to support that right now.
Okay, makes sense. So do you think that ketosis is more something that should be kept as, the back burner, an in case thing, and we should be really using glucose more often?
Yeah, to me, it depends on what is the task you're trying to perform.
Okay.
Right. So if I look at, all out sprinting, high end performance, yeah, ATP, CP, number one. Number two, carbohydrates. I mean, hell, we can even throw lactate in there. Lactate's actually a really, really good fuel. However, if you're just hanging out like we're doing this podcast, no need to use carbohydrates. Using fat is actually going to be a much better fuel. If I go out in my garage and do some rowing at, heart rate of 120, 140, trying to get most of that, right? And these are all dimmer switches. They're not on and off. Trying to get most of that from fat, I think is going to be a metabolic advantage, especially for health. Performance, not that much per se.
Okay.
For ketones, so where do ketones lie on that spectrum? So ketones bioenergetically are a little bit above fat, but they're not quite as good as carbohydrates. So can you get some pretty good performance from them? Yep. Do they do very interesting stuff by cross-checking the amount of glucose in the liver? Yep. So if you give someone a ketone ester, like Dom D'Agostino's shown this, you'll actually start driving down blood glucose. So therapeutically, may there be a huge benefit for that? Absolutely. Does that mean everyone needs to rely only on ketones? No. I don't think so. However, you could make an argument that if we periodize your whole year of nutrition, and your number one goal is, let's say, health, which a nebulous term, but we'll just use it for now.
Yeah.
Maybe taking a period of, 2 months maybe to just be in a ketogenic state, for possibly reducing risk of cancer, which is not my area of research, possibly increasing the upregulation of fat, running the backup system once in a while to make sure it's still working good, maybe getting a little bit more performance out of it. Yeah, I would buy that. I think that to me makes some sense, but it appears trying to transition and out of ketosis, supplements aside, is generally a pretty hard process. Like the only people I've seen who can do that pretty successfully they've been very hardcore ketogenic for like 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
So they appear to be able to do it. Now, does that mean that that's a benefit? I don't know. I mean, all the benefits that are cited are generally around the use of fat as a fuel, not necessarily the ketones. Granted that, the ketones themselves do have some pretty cool possible anti-inflammatory properties in those nature too.
Yeah. So when you're fasting, let's say for 24 hours, you're getting into a form of ketosis, are you not, or is it not at all?
You could get close. It varies a lot. So some of the research, so one of the studies looked at people who were lean versus people who were overweight. What happens during a 24 and 48 hour fast? The people who were overweight were a little bit more metabolically inflexible. So it actually took them almost 48 hours for that level of blood glucose and insulin to kind of hit that bottom and kind of flatline. Healthy people, they hit that in about 24 hours. Even stuff like growth hormone output was completely different between the two groups if you look at time course. So you might not. Fasting in general is good because you're dropping blood glucose, you're massively dropping insulin. And if you want to get into a ketogenic state, you must have a very low level of insulin. Also, it gets confusing when you start adding in more fat, and especially something like MCTs and things like that, because those will get kind of biochemically cross-roaded, I guess you could say, or rerouted or detoured to produce ketones more easily. So I'm not sure if that is a normal biological state, but I would love to see a study, and maybe there's one out there, I haven't seen it, as we take a bunch of people, we have them fast for like 3 days, and we see if you are healthier or more metabolically flexible, do you get into ketosis faster? My gut feeling is that yes. And if you do, there's some data now that's not real sound, that if you can get into ketosis faster, that may preserve more lean muscle mass. So that may be an advantage because ketones tend to have anti-catabolic features to them also.
Interesting. I did not know that. So let's go to some practical stuff here. We know the goal is, from what we've learned from you today, that we want to be metabolically flexible. I get the feeling that a lot of, if you're sedentary, for the average population, people that aren't going to the gym, just eating the standard American diet, they're likely not very metabolically flexible. Would that be true? Or is this what I want to know is
probably true.
Yeah. So what kind of things are we doing that cause us to be metabolically inflexible? And then we'll talk about how we can fix that.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that almost all the good habits you hear, and if you don't do them, you become very metabolically inflexible. Right. Okay. So like sleep is all the rage now, which is great. I don't know how actionable it is, but that's a different discussion. Because it gets into the values of that person. Okay, you're going to give up 2 hours tonight and not be with your family and go to bed earlier? Yeah, you probably should from a physiologic sense. Are you going to do that? Probably not. Okay, now if you want both, now you have to think about what you want to do for your job and your commute and everything else. So it gets complicated pretty fast. But we do know from studies showing that if we impair your sleep, so one of the studies they did is 8-hour sleep block, both groups, and then one group, they fractured their sleep. So they woke them up every hour. They had a little button, say you're awake, yep, go back to sleep. When they did that, it's funny because people won't really report that they knew that was going on, right? So most people don't know how many times they wake up during the night, unless they have an Oura Ring or something like that. And waking up a certain amount is normal. But anyway, they fractionated the group, fragmented it, and they decreased their body's ability to use fat by like 50%. So just the same amount of time, just changing sleep quality impaired their body's ability to use fat. Some studies from the University of Illinois showed that by cutting healthy college students' sleep, I think went from 8 hours to 4 hours, within 5 days, they were borderline type 2 diabetics. That did change once they got more sleep again. So we know sleep is very massive on both sides of the spectrum. Movement is super massive on both sides. So people may not realize that just movement, just walking, like contracting muscle tissue, will actually start pulling glucose out of the bloodstream, independent of insulin. There's something called non-insulin mediated uptake. So just general movement, how many steps do you get? Things like that. Obviously, formal exercise helps. More protein helps because usually you're displacing some of those carbohydrates. So again, a study, I think it was from University of Illinois again, showed that just increasing protein, most people would replace that and push out carbohydrates in their diet, right? The running joke I tell clients is, okay, if you eat 3 chicken breasts before you have birthday cake, you're probably going to eat less birthday cake, right? That doesn't mean that's true all the time, but odds are you're probably going to eat less.
Well, it's a more satiating nutrient, so you would
more satiating, work for repair, all that kind of stuff. So all those things, if you're kind of missing them, will screw it up. So to me, the biggest thing is from the fatty acid end of the spectrum, most people are probably never fasted for any period of time. Most people have high amounts of carbohydrates, but the kicker is it's combined with physiology that is intolerant or does not like a lot of carbohydrates per se. So I think people get mixed up and go, oh, all carbs are bad. It's like, well, what state of the person are you talking about? Are you talking about someone who's trying to break a 2-hour marathon? Or are you talking about Bob who's left an indent in his couch you can see into, right? If you're, the couch, the joke is that the couch physiology is not the same as athlete physiology.
Yeah.
So it's the state of the individual combined with what they're consuming that results in either beneficial things or, a physiologic train wreck.
Mm-hmm. So movement is important. We know that, and especially moving, right after you've consumed a meal, that's a huge point for.
Could be. I would say that's theoretical at this point, but
okay, yeah. It's something we hear about quite a bit. Go for a walk after, it improves digestion and helps with blood sugar levels. You're saying not confirmed?
Some of those studies are extrapolated from type 2 diabetics. So It is true in a type 2 diabetic that if you exercise and then give them a boatload of carbohydrates, they are much more tolerant of those carbohydrates post-exercise, primarily because of GLUT4, translocation, that kind of stuff. In a healthy individual, maybe. I don't think it's bad advice per se, because anything that gets somebody moving, I think is going to be better.
Sure. Yeah.
From a habit base, I think it's a pretty cool idea because you're anchoring habits together. From a physiologic perspective, is it going to make a massive difference? Probably debatable. But I would say it's still a net positive, though.
Yeah, makes sense. So then is there an even greater benefit then to resistance training? Is that going to help you become more metabolically flexible?
Yeah, because resistance training has a double benefit. So let's say I'm doing old school Bill Starr 5x5 on deadlifts, right? So 5 sets of 5 reps, moderately heavy. So as I'm lifting that weight, I'm primarily using ATP, CP, and carbohydrates. The second I set that weight down during the rest period, I'm actually switching to use more fat during the rest period, primarily through aerobic metabolism. Again, this is kind of dramatically oversimplified. But then I go to lift the weight again, boom, I'm using more carbohydrates. All right, so people have heard something called the Epoch Effect. So after exercise, you have an increase in fat use. I don't think it really probably winds up to being anything that's all that useful for body comp reasons. But from a health perspective, weight training has a double benefit of increasing the use of carbohydrates during and possibly having some beneficial effects on the use of fat during that rest period after you're done with that kind of work. So you get kind of help from both ends of the spectrum.
So you'd see that not just with the resistance training, but potentially high intensity interval training too, if you're doing sprints and then you're just kind of...
Yeah, you'll see the same thing with high intensity interval training. Like in the lab, we'll use something called wind gates. Martin Gabalia out of Canada has published a lot of really cool data on that.
Cool. Now, what about endurance training? If you're going for long, 30-minute, hour runs, is there any benefit to the metabolic flexibility at that point?
Yeah, so the first question I have for those people is, why are you running? And there's no right answer, because people still have in their head that, bro, I gotta get lean, I'm gonna go start running. I'm like, maybe that's a good choice. I mean, having more aerobic benefit is good. So I'll ask them, what is your goal? Like, if your goal is to be a highly competitive runner, at some point, adding carbohydrates is going to be beneficial. If your goal is, I just want to improve my aerobic base, I want to feel a little bit better, body comp's kind of more of my goal, I'm not going to do it at a super high intensity, then I would say, do it kind of fasted, or what I call semi-fasted, maybe a little protein beforehand. I think that's going to be a benefit from a health standpoint. And what is the goal, right? So there I'm trying to teach your body how to use fat more efficiently.
I love that you said that, by the way, because that's something that I always try to teach is, if you're trying to lose weight, running is probably not your best option unless it's in the form of interval training. But I don't know why that's such a popular choice still. But
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, my bias right now is if people can get like on a rower or something, assuming they don't have a lot of hip or low back issues, I think that's really good because you can program it to do high intensity work because you're pulling against a flywheel. And I mean, doing a 500 meter on a Concept 2 rower is always just freaking brutal. But you warm up and you're done. You're literally done in like total of 5 minutes, like the entire time. But if you want to do more moderate stuff, you can do more moderate stuff too. But yeah, again, it just depends on the person, their biomechanics and things of that nature.
For sure. Okay. So I don't have any other questions on metabolic flexibility. Is there anything that we missed that you think is important for the listeners to know or to understand?
I think probably a couple of things is just, figure out what your goals are and then try to figure out what things you're kind of willing to compromise on and what things you're not. I think it's trendy and sexy to do whatever the latest crazy, let's fast for a full week and I don't know, let's do ketogenic type diet. And it just seems like the thing is, well, just try harder. It's like, no, just figure out what is the end that you want to do? What does that look like? If you're fine doing a ketogenic diet and you love high fat food, you don't really miss carbohydrates that much, then cool. That might be a viable option for you. But the amount of people I ran into who say, well, but I love carbohydrates. I'm like, okay, well, maybe doing a diet that severely restricts carbohydrate isn't the best long-term solution. Now, could you kind of, power your way through it with a lot of, gonadal fortitude and make it? Yeah, maybe. But then what do you do when you get to your goal, right? What happens then? And that's the thing that I think people tend to forget about. And I'm fine with people saying, hey, as a short-term goal, I'm going to do this thing. It's more extreme for a period of time and then transition to something else. That's not where I would start, but that's okay. You put time and effort and you thought it. And as long as you don't hurt yourself too bad in that period, and if it's short enough, you probably get away with it. But people tend to do the most extreme approach and then think they're just going to be able to willpower their way through it and don't think about what's going to happen at the end of that.
Yeah.
So I think that's, and if they're not used to thinking about those things, then obviously hiring someone who can help them is going to be beneficial.
Yeah. The end goal. Yes. If you want to lose weight, that's not necessarily the end goal because you want to lose weight, but then you want to maintain the weight that you're at. So that's where I think, right. That's what you need to think of too is you can lose the weight quickly doing X diet, but that's not the real goal. The real goal is now to live at that weight for the rest of your life. So you got to think what the end goal is, not your short-term goal. So I really like that. That's a good one.
Yeah. And the studies dramatically support that, right? So recidivism rate, so how many people lose weight and then can't keep it off, it's in like the 90-ish%. So most people, given a short enough time and given enough motivation, are actually pretty good at losing weight. We can argue about body comp and lean body mass and all that kind of stuff. But maintaining that successfully for a long period of time, have people done it? Absolutely. Can it be done? Absolutely. Is it normal for most people to have success doing that? Sadly not. So.
Very, very good point. Okay, so where can people, if they want to learn more from you, where can they find you on the internet or wherever else people can find you?
Yeah, on the interwebs is MikeTNelson.com. And most information I have is on the newsletter now, which is free to hop on. So at the top of the website there, you'll see a little area where you can hop on and get information on that. And that's probably the best place.
Awesome. Okay, so I have one more question for you. And this is a question that I ask all the guests that come on the show. So you've been on a health journey. You've been working on your health for a long time. If you were to go back to day one of that health journey and forget everything that you currently know, what would be the one piece of advice that you'd want to keep with yourself, or the one piece of advice you'd want to tell yourself if you're just starting out?
I would say the main piece of advice is that it's going to be a journey, and that's kind of what you want it to be. Obviously, you want to reach this particular goal and things of that nature. But I think myself and clients tend to get too hyper specific on a goal in a very short period of time. I had a conversation with my friend Adam Glass a couple months ago, and we both kind of agreed that no matter how fast we or any of our clients would make progress, it was never fast enough. So it doesn't matter how fast you're making progress, you'll think that it's never going to be fast enough. But if you're just focused on the journey and the process that goes into that, the outcome will kind of take care of itself. And I think that, at least I know for myself, that would prevent me from doing probably 90% of the stupid crap I did along the way. So
yeah, trust the process.
I hope it would. I don't know.
Awesome. All right, Mike. Well, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing this information. Very interesting stuff, very cool stuff. And I think something that's important for a lot of people to know about. So appreciate the work that you're doing. And again, for coming on here to share it.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate you having me on here.